Every time you raise your voice, I see the greener grass. Every time you run for cover, I see this pasture. Every time we're in a funk, I picture a different choice. Anytime we're in a rut, this distant grandeur. My tendency to want to do away feels natural, and my urgency to dream of softer places feels understandable. But the only way out is through. The faster we're in, the better. The only way out is through. Hotel Molly. The only way out is through. The only way we'll feel better. The only way out is through. Hotel Molly. Every time that I'm confused, I think there must be easier ways. Every time our horns are locked on towel throwing. Every time we're at a loss, we bolted from difficulty. Anytime we're in stalemate, a final bowing. My tendency to want to hide away feels easier, and the immediacy of picturing another place comforting to go. But the only way out is through. The faster we're in, the better. The only way out is through. Ultimately, the only way out is through. The only way we'll feel better. The only way out is through. Ultimately. We could just walk away and hide our heads in the sand. We could just call it quits only to start over again with somebody else. Every time we're stuck in struggle, I'm down for the count that day. Every time I dream of quick fix, I'm assuaged. Now I know it's hard when it's through, and I'm damned if I don't know quick fix way. What formerly was treatment silence, now outdated. My tendency to want to run feels unnatural now. The urgency to want to give to you what I want most feels good. And the only way out is through. The faster we're in, the better. The only way out is through. Ultimately, the only way out is through. The only way we'll feel better. The only way out is through. Ultimately, the only way out is through. The faster we're in, the better. The only way out is through. Ultimately, the only way out is through. The only way we'll get better. The only way out is through. Ultimately.
Good evening, everyone. I am pleased to welcome you here, and we're going to talk about a variety of issues today, hopefully within a very short time, instead of just going long. I hope the dog doesn't randomly jump on me as well. I do want to remind you, though, as you see the image that I usually use as my front background, please subscribe to me on all tech platforms, on Odyssey. Odyssey has a new app out. It actually is much more functional than their old one, which was the library app. You can find me on Rumble. They also have a mobile app that's steadily getting better, BitChute, which I've always been a fan of. You can always find me here on YouTube, but I'm not happy about the policies of YouTube. You can find me sometimes putting audio-only content on Podbean, and the other sites are Gabminds, Telegram, and Getter, which are more for messaging and comments and sharing media. And this isn't just to hear stuff from me. Sometimes you can just send me things that you think are cool and important. And my newsletter is on Substack. In fact, there's a new article that I wrote, published I think last week, concerning one of the more pinheaded articles that I've seen that claims to analyze, voting intention in Pennsylvania. So please take a look at any of those. There is an article, though, that I wrote this very week for American Greatness that is now live on their website. It is called Break Glass in Case of Kremlin Disinformation. Now, I will say that I try to remain balanced and neutral whenever I can. I have biases, but I don't want to force people to digest information. But and most importantly, I don't want to spread falsehoods just in the name of a good cause. Things that are called like the noble lie. The best example of the noble lie in recent memory was the recommendation by Dr. Fauci. Although we now don't know what to make of this, but the early recommendation of his was not to wear facial masks at the beginning of the corona crisis. Now, of course, this has caused a lot of confusion, and later he flip-flopped and said, well, the reason I was doing this was because there were limited supplies. So I was actually doing it, I was lying in the public interest. That's what he was saying. Dr. Fauci and people who are advocates of major government intervention will always support the noble lie because they think that the average person isn't smart enough to really comprehend the rationale behind their decisions, or people, they don't believe that they even owe people a real explanation of what's going on, which is exactly how we've gotten into many of these crises. And I think the same approach to COVID is what's been used against people who are trying to navigate their way through what's going on in Ukraine. And it's very unfortunate. And you can actually see whether you're using that crisis or this one as the template, media lies actually have often consequences that affect human lives and affect the lives of entire communities and entire and if you want even to go into ecosystems, if you're talking about misinformation related to environmental issues, this goes through, and I'll go through it very briefly, 5 myths about Ukraine that I think are useful. And it doesn't really, the title doesn't really do it justice. But there is this sense among American media that if you actually tell people what really is the problem with the Ukraine crisis, you are being an apologist for the Kremlin and for Vladimir Putin. And the reality is that whatever the criminality or cynicism of what Putin has done, or the brutality of any offensive that he's done, or the civilian casualties that he's caused, which are, you have to condemn them, and you have to condemn the basic action of invading another sovereign state, whatever your reason for it is. Ukraine was not trying to invade Russia. There are cases, of course, which I sort of hint at, where you do have a little bit of ambiguity. There was a 6-day war where the Israelis claimed that Egypt and Syria were going to invade, and they had to do a preemptive strike. And indeed, some documentation was used to prove that, but not everybody accepts that explanation on the part of Israel. So that is one of the reasons that you have to, first of all, put it in plain English that this is not a reason to validate what the Russian government and Vladimir Putin have done, and still say that it is not in the United States' interest to be involved directly in the conflict, and also that the pretense that we're defending democracy in Ukraine and that the people who are fighting on behalf of the Ukrainian cause, they're not necessarily angels, right? And we're going to see that some of them, not just that they're not angels, they're also, they don't exactly have their head on straight. I'm talking about American volunteers in Ukraine. Anyway, so I go through 5 myths. The first myth is that the U.S. is defending democracy in Ukraine. Now, if you want to differentiate between the Russians and the Ukrainians, certainly Russia is the more totalitarian state. They have much more of a control over the press and over information and public gatherings and protests and everything. There's no comparison really between Ukraine and Russia in terms of state control of personal expression. And I think that it is something that those of us that are non-interventionists, we still have to make it clear that the type of government that they have in Russia, we would never want to live under, right? Where there's strict regulation of the media, there's strict regulation of the education system all the way from the top, right? So your personal preferences as a local parent probably are not being considered even at the most minor level in Russia. And also economic freedom is not necessarily a given in Russia because there's so much that's wrapped up in the government through its various permitting processes allowing people to engage in business or not. Now they don't control the economy directly. They don't have direct ownership the way they did under the USSR, but they certainly do not have a free economy. Now Ukraine is a little bit different, but they also have a lot of corruption there. They've always been a very corrupt successor state of the Soviet Union, and unfortunately, we've been led to believe that Ukraine is miles ahead of Russia in terms of its ethics and its virtue. And the reality is that a lot of the problems that Russia suffers from on a societal level are common with Ukraine because they have a very close history. They have a very close history in terms of heritage and everything. And I go through that. I explain in the article that many of the same people that were in charge under the Soviet regime, they became the first generation of leaders of the independent Ukraine. They're called the nomenklatura in Russian parlance. And for the past 30 years, a lot of those people have been sort of aging out of the system, and now we're having younger people ease into it. But the fact is that there's remnants of them, and a number of major Ukrainian politicians to this day started their careers as mid-level managers and bureaucrats under the Soviet communist system. And therefore, while there are people like Zelensky who are a little younger and they never really were part of that system, you're still relying on the same sort of mindset that's transferred from one generation to another that isn't easily abandoned, right? Young people tend to try to depart from their parents' ways of thinking, but it's not always successful because there are learned behaviors that even if you rebel against the people who taught you them, you're still used to doing it a certain way. And certainly Ukraine is like that. Now, the Orange Revolution of 2004, that was the first attempt to break with Russia. It's partially successful. And then there was a president, Viktor Yushchenko, who was in power for about 5 years, unsuccessful, pro-Western, and he was immediately succeeded by Viktor Yanukovych, who was his rival. Now, both of them had been members of the nomenklatura. And in 2013, as Yanukovych was trying to negotiate a new trade and status agreement with the European Union, he'd already concluded one with Russia, and he decided to back out of negotiations because he felt that it was a little bit too cumbersome, the terms that were being put on Ukraine. That precipitated the Euromaidan, the big revolution in Ukraine. He ended up having to flee to Russia. There's no argument that he was much more of a pro-Russia figure. However, the idea that what has come next is democracy, that's the real myth, because a lot of the people who came after him, Alexander Turchinov and Arseny Yatsenyuk, they are Ukrainian politicians who basically are favorites of the United States and the European Union, who would be more hospitable towards policies that are they're pro-American, pro-NATO, and would generally alienate Russia. So the rest is history. There was the whole Crimea crisis. There's the war in the Donbass. Those are all attempts by Russia to force Ukraine back under its thumb and carve away parts of it as punitive measures. And so far, the United States has done very little to counteract that in an effective way. They've tried to do non-lethal aid. They've tried to do lethal aid. The one thing that they've never tried is to actually negotiate before this war some sort of separate status for Ukraine. And that's really the problem here. Ukraine has a very low ranking on Transparency International, and they've also limited broadcast licenses for opposition media. So this idea that Ukraine is this great beacon of democracy and freedom just isn't true. It's very, very flawed, and I think people need to wake up to who we're really supporting and some of the other complications of that. The second myth is that Ukraine is fighting to remain sovereign and independent. That kind of goes with the first one. The fact is, Ukraine has applied to join the European Union. That in and of itself is a statement that you're willing to compromise your sovereignty. If the European Union was such a free and democratic area, why is it that so many of the European Union functionaries are not elected, or they're elected very indirectly? They're either elected indirectly or they're appointed by some of the constituent governments, and there's a very opaque bureaucracy to it. It's one of the reasons that the British decided to leave the European Union. They voted. In fact, despite the government of the UK being for remaining in the European Union, the people decided to leave it, which is probably one of the more democratic events of the past 60 to 70 years, that the public, despite all of the messaging and the fear-mongering among the government leaders in the UK, including David Cameron, they decided to leave it. Now, what is Ukraine doing? They're doing the exact opposite. They're going to leave the Russian sphere of influence, which has its own problems that we've already gone through, for the European sphere of influence that has some of the same things. Maybe not the same methods. You might not see the European states invading Ukraine in order to force it to comply, but you could see them employing sanctions. You could see them isolating it, like they have done with Poland regarding Poland's policies towards refugees. And the third myth is that the Russian invasion ends the post-war international military non-aggression between nation states. So this was put forward by Tom Friedman of the New York Times, and he made some sort of statement that indicated that, well, we haven't seen anything like this since World War II. Well, that's plainly untrue. We had the Korean War. We had the Arab-Israelis War. We had the Falklands War. These are all wars between sovereign states, by the way. Let's not forget all the wars that were between states that or civil wars between states, the Rwanda genocide, the Congolese civil war that involved many states using proxies, the Yugoslav wars, or the Balkan conflicts as they're sometimes called, or the Soviet invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia. So all of those conflicts have occurred since World War II, and all of them involved one state invading another one in order to take it over. We even had the U.S. invading Panama in 1989. So that is one myth that I think, and by the way, it's a myth I think that many people openly have always doubted. They don't really believe in this post-war liberal international order. If you don't see it, there is a poll up there. What is the story that you're following the closest? The Hunter Biden laptop story, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Jesse Smollett's legal saga, the feud between Chris Cuomo and CNN. So those are the four stories. I'm going to try to mention them. I'm not going to go too far in depth. The fourth myth is labeling the Azov Battalion as a neo-Nazi group is misleading at best. That's not true, and maybe in the coming week we can go through some of the videos, but there's videos from the BBC, there's videos from The Guardian, Vice News, all of these left-wing media organizations that for many years were sounding an alarm that it might be a bad idea to cooperate with these groups. as partners of the United States. And all of them pointed to both hardcore racist imagery in their among their people. Remember, in the U.S., we've had events like CPAC, where because the stage was seemingly shaped like a runic symbol that could be used by a neo-Nazi group, they've tried to cancel CPAC or get them kicked out of a hotel. But when you have foreign militias in Ukraine, Ukrainian ethnic militias that actually use openly imagery that is plainly racist, plainly extremist, and over the top, you do have organizations like the Atlantic Council that try to say, that they try to say that this is sort of a very small minority and we shouldn't really use them to paint a broad brush of the Ukrainian people or the Ukrainian army. Well, let me put it this way. You have an organization, the Azov Brigade. They're one of the more engaged groups in the war in the Donbass against the separatist Russian Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic. So they've been the tip of the spear. And the government has been leaning heavily on them as sort of a vanguard against the Russians for I think it's over 7 years now, and trying to have them basically shoulder a lot of the burden of going into battle against the Russian separatists. And they have their own problems on the Russian side. They have their own extremism. They negate Ukraine's right to be an independent country. Those are issues that the Russians have. But the fact of the matter is, why is this a big problem for Americans? It is because, as I think it was the Guardian report had, you actually have foreign extremists from Sweden and other countries that journey over to Ukraine and try to, I think it's from Time Magazine. So you actually have extremist fighters from Sweden. Let me show you. That go over to Ukraine, try to get training, and they bring back the same sort of ideology to their home country. Let me unmute this.
Поважати своїх батьків, любити своїх дітей, пишатися за свою країну – це нормально.
Events like this also tend to attract recruits.
So what they highlighted here is that there is some homophobic or racist tendencies among this Ukrainian militia. Now, look, in and of itself, why is it the business of the U.S. what these organizations are doing within Ukraine and what their politics are? I don't necessarily care, right? Because the fact is that these groups they've coalesced as an alliance, an electoral alliance, and they haven't really gotten that far. This is why I do care.
From abroad. One of the ones I met was named Robin, who had just arrived in Ukraine from Sweden, where he told me he's wanted for hate crimes.
This is so hard to explain the surroundings for someone who's watching this, It's surreal. It's like, I don't know, it's like something you read about the great Germany before, in the 1920s. It's a revival of the Indo-European soul. Mm-hmm. And it's all happening here in Ukraine.
Afterward, we rode back to the Azov base in northern Kyiv, where Azov commanders had allowed Robin to stay as a potential recruit.
We are Aryans, and we will rise again. That's a way of life,
So that was Time Magazine as recently as last January. In fact, 2 days after January 6th. So on January 8th, they're talking about, what about these white supremacist militias in Ukraine? So concurrent to what was going on, the media was already sounding the alarm that these might be the wrong people to have an alliance with. So that is something that's a fact. And these militias, they invoke a lot of the same heritage as some of these hardcore racist militias from World War II and from even before that, after World War I, during the Russian Civil War. So you can read through that. And then the fifth myth, of course, is that questioning media narratives is akin to peddling Kremlin propaganda. Now, to counter this, you have to remember some of the people who are in the federal government today, who are very high at the top, like John Kerry, John Kerry, at one point, he participated in an event called Winter Soldier, which was a very controversial organized set of hearings by former like Army and other military figures in Vietnam who were claiming that the U.S. was performing war crimes in Vietnam. So was that North Vietnamese propaganda when he was doing that in 1971 while we actually had troops in Vietnam fighting the communist insurgency and invasion over there? Nobody uses that standard. Barbara Lee of California has voted against authorizations for use of military force for decades. She voted against the war in Kosovo. So these are the same sorts of stances that we've seen from politicians like that back all the way back then, and they were never canceled at the time. I mean, people would certainly criticize them, but it doesn't invalidate our right to say something about any potential U.S. involvement in this conflict, especially since America isn't actually in the war yet and hopefully will remain out of it. So that's about it for the Ukraine crisis. Except, so there is this article from New York Magazine talking about the beefing Boogaloo boys. Here's the one from Daily Mail. You have this guy who went to Ukraine.
So for any people who are
And just listen to what he says.
wondering what is going on, all right? We were part of the Georgia National Legion, the 102nd Ukrainian Territorial Defense. Okay? Our base up, the base right next to us up. Americans, British, tons of British dead. All right? They're not saying nothing. They're counting our dead as their dead. They're trying to send us to Kiev with weapons, no kit, plates. The people who are lucky enough to get weapons are only getting magazines with like rounds, okay? When they wanted to send us to Kiev, we said no. Our whole group, a bunch of Americans, Canadians, British. So they told us we had to get out or they were going to shoot us in the back, all right? So me, this British guy, and
All right, so since I'm pressed for time, he goes on to talk about how they were basically being threatened if they did not go to the front in Kiev. Now, this guy, I think it's a good idea. It's good that he got out of the situation if he did, but this is something I have personal experience with. Having been an American who went to serve because I have Israeli citizenship from my parents, I served in the Israeli military. I can tell you that you have to really weigh the decision very heavily. So in Ukraine, I would say it's an even harder decision that you probably should not take to go to Ukraine because, first of all, I knew some of the language over there when I moved there. Most of these guys going to Ukraine don't know any Ukrainian or Russian. They don't have any family connection there. There's nobody really to be their advocate. And this idea that, oh, you're going to go over there and you're going to be some sort of hero and you're going to be some sort of legion that defends defends Ukraine as part of the world statement of support for it against Russia. It's probably not going to happen because you don't necessarily, just because somebody hands you a rifle or hands you ammunition, that doesn't mean that you have the means to actually survive in a war zone. You need provisions, you need clothing, you need medical supplies, you need all of that stuff. You need water, most importantly of all. You could potentially need protective gear against some sort of nuclear or biological assault, or chemical or biological assault, or even a nuclear assault. Not that it would matter. There's no way to defend that against that. But the bottom line is that these people are way in over their head. And unfortunately, the government, the U.S. government and other governments have facilitated them traveling to Ukraine to do this. Remember that there were people who were doing this in the past to go travel and fight with ISIS. And many of them ended up dying. American citizens and British citizens, some Australians would go over there. And some people would say, oh, that's basically people who have no business being here anyway, going out and getting their just desserts. I think that in this case, okay, people who want to go and help Ukraine, this is one of the worst ways to do it. You're not actually going to be a good resource on the battlefield because you probably can't communicate with other Ukrainian troops. So I think this is one of the worst ideas. And if this account is true, this was totally predictable. That's why I called this. This stream was about. Where's my title here? Poor decisions often have predictable outcomes. So that brings us to our last stories. The Hunter Biden laptop. This is from Glenn Greenwald. The New York Times now admits the Biden laptop, falsely called Russian disinformation, is authentic. Hunter Biden made all of these terrible decisions over his entire life. And Americans are now paying for those decisions because the media made another decision to cover for him and say, well, it's not our job to validate this. We're just going to pretend that this was some sort of Russian disinformation campaign. We won't have any proof that it is, but we're going to behave as if that's what's going on because we don't think that it's in our interest to support, to support this story by actually researching it and to figure out if it's true or not and whether we as Americans should be suspicious of the person who could be the U.S. president, whether his son is compromised, whether he's been basically taking money from foreign governments. That is something that the media did in 2020 that we're feeling the consequences of now. And there's no excuse for it. And unfortunately, I think some of them are still using the whole charade that it was a mistake and that they had to do their due diligence or whatever. It was not a mistake. It was a coordinated effort. It was social media companies that did it. Moving on. Chris Cuomo, another media-related story, is now suing CNN, and he's trying to bring down Don Lemon and Jake Tapper and Brian Stelter and Jeffrey Toobin and all these other people who had ethically questionable activities when they were working at CNN altogether. And now Cuomo is out and the rest of them are still in. I would say that it's greatly entertaining, and it's another example of poor decisions leading to predictable outcomes because it was all Jeff Zucker's fault. He put all these people on the air. He let them get away with all of their various shenanigans, whether it was Cuomo and his brother and Cuomo's own Me Too issues, as well as Jeffrey Toobin's incident on the air where he engaged in some self-help, or Brian Stelter's open lies and misinformation that are basic, and also caping for Cuomo and sticking up for him even when it was obvious that Cuomo was engaged in some sort of ethically questionable behavior, such as advising his brother as a CNN commentator. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, he's giving him legal advice about the Me Too allegations. So all of those, they are part of Jeff Zucker's poisonous culture within CNN. So I think that besides that, I did want to talk briefly about the issue of Jesse Smollett getting out of jail. He's now going to sue the two men who were his attackers, the two Nigerian men, the Osundairo brothers. I don't think that lawsuit is going to end well for him, especially if they countersue, because basically at this point, I think that he's been pushing his luck for the past few years, and this is somebody who has some sort of narcissistic disorder. Everybody knows that he has no evidence that what happened to him was actually true, and that on the contrary, there's overwhelming evidence that it was a hoax and that the people who attacked him were paid by him to attack him, and that he lied to the police, and that it was all staged. And yet he won't give up the lie, and he continues to profess his innocence, and he's roping his family in, and they make these public statements professing his innocence. And how it will end, I don't know how it will end, but I'm sure that at some point, Jesse Smollett, once he pushes his luck, he will piss off somebody who will not actually give him an easy route out, right? And I would think it would be the Justice Department, but I don't think at this point I would think it would be the justice system, but they've so far given him slaps on the wrist. I would say that at some point he's going to piss off someone within the entertainment industry, and he'll be basically, a pariah, and he'll have to resort to some sort of embarrassing publicity stunts, the way that Demi Lovato has been doing, and that's going to be the end of him. And that's the way that narcissists behave. They want the attention, and they can't actually process any criticism, because to them everything that goes wrong against them is an injustice, and there's no other way that they could possibly be wrong. Anyway, me and my dog would like to say have a good weekend, and we hope that you enjoyed St. Patrick's Day. Here, Ziggy, come here. No, come to Poppy. Come to Poppy. Here we go. So have a good weekend, and I hope you enjoyed your holiday if you had it. And unfortunately, the news isn't great, but don't let it keep you depressed. And try to, I guess, develop friends that are not on the internet, and develop relationships with the people around you, and with your family, and with your pets. And other than that, peace, and have a great weekend. And remember to follow me on all of the alternative social media. Have a great day, and goodbye.
Every time you raise your voice, I see the greener grass. Every time you run for cover, I see this pasture. Every time we're in a funk, I picture a different choice. Anytime we're in a rut, this distant grandeur. My tendency to want to do away feels natural, and my urgency to dream of softer places feels understandable. But the only way out is through. The faster we're in, the better. The only way out is through. Hotel Molly. The only way out is through. The only way we'll feel better. The only way out is through. Hotel Molly. Every time that I'm confused, I think there must be easier ways. Every time our horns are locked on towel throwing. Every time we're at a loss, we bolted from difficulty. Anytime we're in stalemate, a final bowing. My tendency to want to hide away feels easier, and the immediacy of picturing another place comforting